Linda had come from the other place long ago, before he was born, with a man who was his father. Bernard listened eagerly. She had gone walking alone in those mountains over there to the north, had fallen down a steep place and hurt her head. Go on, said Bernard excitedly. Some hunters from Malpais had found her and brought her to the village. As for the man who was his father, Linda had never seen him again. His name was Tomakin. Yes, Thomas was the DHC's first name. He must have flown away, back to the other place, away without her. A bad, unkind, unnatural man. And so I was born in Malpais, he ended. In Malpais. And he shook his head. The ugliness of that little house on the edge of the village. A space of dust and rubbish separated it from the village. 2 hungry dogs were pushing their noses hungrily into the rubbish at its door. Inside, when they entered, the air smelt strongly and it was loud with flies. Linda, the young man called. From the inner room, a woman's voice said thickly, Coming! They waited. In bowls on the floor were the remains of a meal, perhaps of several meals. The door opened. A very large, yellow-haired woman came in and stood staring at the strangers, her mouth wide open in surprise. Lenina noticed with horror that 2 of the front teeth were missing, and the colour of the ones that remained, she could hardly look. So fat, and the loose hanging cheeks all rough and purple, and all the lines in her face and the blood marks on her nose and in her eyes, and that neck, and the cloth she wore over her head, torn and dirty, and under the brown cloth that she wore over her body, those enormous breasts, the great round stomach. Oh, much worse than the old man, much worse. And suddenly the creature burst into a flood of speech, rushed at her with her arms stretched out, and Ford, it was too horrible. In another moment she'd be sick, held Lenina tightly to her fat body and began to kiss her. Ford! Such wet kisses, and she smelt too horrible, obviously never had a bath. And she had been drinking some very strong alcohol. Lenina broke free as quickly as she could. A twisted face stared at her. The creature was crying. Oh, my dear, if you only knew how glad, after all these years, a civilized face, yes, and civilized clothes, because I thought I should never see a piece of real artificial silk again. And those lovely shorts. Do you know, dear, I've still got my old clothes, the ones I came in, put away in a box. I'll show them to you afterwards, though, of course, the cloth has all gone into holes. I suppose John has told you what I had to suffer, and not a gram of soma to be had. Only a drink of mescal every now and then, when Popeye used to bring it. Popeye is a boy I used to know, but it makes you feel so bad afterwards, the mescal does, and sick. Besides, it always made that awful feeling of being ashamed much worse the next day. And I was so ashamed. Just think of it, me, a beater, having a baby. Put yourself in my place. The mere suggestion made Lenina tremble. Though it wasn't my fault, I swear, I still don't know how it happened, because I did all that I was supposed to, but all the same, it happened. She drew a deep breath, shook her head, opened her eyes again, then blew her nose on her fingers and wiped them on her skirt. Oh, I'm so sorry, she said, seeing Lenina's look of disgust. I oughtn't to have done that, but what are you to do here?" Linda shook her head. "I tried to tell them about disease and about keeping things clean when I first came here, but they didn't understand. And in the end, I suppose I got used to it. And anyhow, how can you keep things clean when there isn't any running hot water? And look at these clothes. This horrible wool isn't like artificial material. It never wears out. It lasts and lasts, and you're supposed to mend it if it gets torn. But I'm a beater. I worked in the fertilizing room. Nobody ever taught me to do anything like that. It wasn't my business. Besides, it never used to be right to mend clothes. Throw them away when they've got holes in them and buy new. The more stitches, the less riches. But it's all different here. It's like living with mad people. Everything they do is mad." She lowered her voice. "Take the way they have one another here. Mad, I tell you, absolutely mad. Everyone belongs to everyone else, don't they?" she whispered, pulling at Lenina's arm. Lenina nodded and turned her head away from the smell of Linda's breath. "Well, here," the other went on, "nobody's supposed to belong to more than one person. If you have people in the ordinary way, the others think you're bad. Once, a lot of women came and shouted at me because their men came to see me. Well, why not? And then they rushed at me. No, it was too awful. I can't tell you about it." Linda covered her face with her hands and cried. "They're so hateful here, the women. Mad and cruel. And of course, they don't know anything about bottles or contraceptives. So they're having children all the time, like dogs. It's too disgusting. And to think that oh, Ford. And yet John was a great comfort to me. I don't know what I should have done without him, even though he did get so upset whenever a man, quite as a tiny boy even, once, but that was when he was bigger, he tried to kill poor Waihu Siwa, or was it Pope? Just because I used to have them sometimes. Because I never could make him understand that that's what civilized people ought to do. Being mad's catching, I believe. Anyhow, John seems to have caught it from the Indians, because, of course, he was with them a lot. Even though they were so unkind to him and wouldn't let him do all the things the other boys did, which was a good thing in a way, because it made it easier for me to condition him a little. Though you've no idea how difficult that is. There's so much one doesn't know. It wasn't my business to know. I mean, when a child asks you how a helicopter works, or who made the world, well, what are you to answer if you're a beta and have always worked in the fertilizing room? What are you to answer? Chapter 8. John. Outside, in the dust and among the rubbish, there were 4 dogs now. Bernard and John were walking slowly up and down. "So hard for me to realise," Bernard was saying, "to put it all together, as though we were living in different worlds, in different centuries. A mother and all this dirt, and gods, and old age, and disease." He shook his head. "It's almost unbelievable. I shall never understand unless you explain." "Explain what?" "This." He pointed to the village. "That." And it was the little house outside the village. "Everything, all your life." "But what is there to say?" "From the beginning, as far back as you can remember." "As far back as I can remember," John thought deeply. There was a long silence. It was very hot. They had eaten a lot of bread and vegetables. Linda said, "Come and lie down, baby." They lay down together in the big bed. "Sing!" And Linda sang, nursery songs. Her voice grew fainter and fainter. There was a loud noise, and he woke suddenly. A man was standing by the bed, enormous, frightening. He was saying something to Linda, and Linda was laughing. She had pulled the bedclothes up to her chin, but the man pulled them down again. His hair was like two black ropes, and round his arm was a lovely silver band with blue stones in it. He liked the band, but all the same, he was frightened. He hid his face against Linda's body. Linda put her hand on him, and he felt safer. In those other words he did not understand so well, she said to the man, "Not with John here." But the man took hold of one of his arms, and it hurt. He screamed. The man put out his other hand and lifted him up. Linda held him, saying, "No, no!" The man said something short and angry. He kicked and struggled, but the man carried him across to the door, opened it, put him down on the floor in the middle of the other room, and went away, shutting the door behind him. He got up, he ran to the door. Standing on the tips of his toes, he could just reach the big wooden handle. He turned it and pushed, but the door wouldn't open. "Linda!" he shouted. She didn't answer. He remembered a huge room, rather dark, and there were big wooden things with strings tied to them, and lots of women standing round them, making cloth, Linda said. Linda told him to sit in the corner with the other children while she went and helped the women. He played with the little boys for a long time. Suddenly, people started talking very loudly, and there were the women pushing Linda away, and Linda was crying. She went to the door, and he ran after her. He asked her why they were angry. "Because I broke something," she said, and then she got angry too. "How should I know how to do their stupid weaving?" she said. "Horrible savages!" He asked her what savages were. When they got back to their house, Popeye was waiting at the door, and he came in with them. He had a big bottle full of stuff that looked like water, but it wasn't water. It was something with a bad smell that burnt your mouth and made you cough. Linda drank some, and Popeye drank some, and then Linda laughed a lot and talked very loudly, and then she and Popeye went into the other room. When Popeye went away, he went into the room. Linda was in bed and so fast asleep that he couldn't wake her. Popeye used to come often. He said the stuff in the bottle was called mescal, but Linda said it ought to be called soma, only it made you feel ill afterwards. He hated Popeye. He hated them all the men who came to see Linda. One afternoon, when he had been playing with the other children, it was cold, he remembered, and there was snow on the mountains. He came back to the house and heard angry voices in the bedroom. They were women's voices, and they said words he didn't understand, but he knew they were bad words. Then suddenly, crash! Something fell over. He heard people moving about quickly, and there was another crash, and then a noise of someone being hit. Then Linda screamed, "Oh, don't! He ran in. There were 3 women in dark clothes. Linda was on the bed. One of the women was holding her wrists. Another was lying across her legs so that she couldn't kick. The third was hitting her with a whip. Once, twice, 3 times, and each time Linda screamed. Crying, he caught hold of the woman's brown hand and bit it as hard as he could. She cried out, pulled her hand free and gave him such a push that he fell down. While he was lying on the ground, she hit him 3 times with the whip. It hurt more than anything he had ever felt, like fire. "But why did they want to hurt you?" he asked that night. "I don't know. How should I know? They say those men are their men." And she burst into tears. He pressed against her. He put his arm round her neck. Linda cried out, "Oh, be careful, my shoulder, oh!" And she pushed him away hard. His head knocked against the wall painfully. "Stupid boy!" she shouted, and then suddenly she began to hit him. "Linda!" he cried out. "Oh, Mother, don't!" "I'm not your mother. I won't be your mother. Turned into a savage," she shouted. "Having young ones like an animal. If I hadn't had you, I might have gone to the inspector. I might have got away, but not with a baby. That would have been too shameful." He saw that she was going to hit him again and lifted his arm to protect his face. "Oh, don't, Linda, please don't." He shut his eyes, expecting the blow, but she didn't hit him. After a little time, he opened his eyes and saw that she was looking at him. He tried to smile at her. Suddenly, she put her arms round him and kissed him again and again. The happiest times were when she told him about the other place, how you could go flying whenever you liked, and how you could have music out of a box, and about the other boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies in lovely clean bottles, everything so clean, no smells and no dirt at all, and people never lonely, but living together and being happy all the time. Sometimes, when he and the other children were tired with too much playing, one of the old men of the village would tell them strange stories of the gods and of the beginning of the world. Strange stories that he did not fully understand. Lying in bed later, he would think of heaven and London and rows of clean bottles and Jesus and Linda flying up and the great director of world production and R. Ford himself. The boys said bad things about Linda and about the men who came to see her. Sometimes they laughed at him for being such a mess. When he tore his clothes, Linda did not know how to mend them. In the other place, she told him, people threw away clothes with holes in them and got new ones. But Linda taught him to read, drawing pictures and letters on the wall with the point of a burnt stick. And when the other boys shouted at him, he said to himself, "But I can read, and they can't. They don't even know what reading is." When he could read well enough, Linda gave him a thin little book that she had kept in a box with her clothes from the other place. It was a book of instructions for beta embryo store workers, telling them what chemicals to use for various processes in the treatment of the bottled embryos. Soon he could read all the words quite well, even the longest. But what did they mean? He asked Linda, but even when she could answer, it didn't seem to make it very clear, and generally she couldn't answer at all. "What are chemicals?" he would ask. "Oh, different kinds of salts for making bones develop, and solutions for keeping the deltas and epsilons small and unintelligent, and all that sort of thing." "But how do you make chemicals, Linda? Where do they come from?" "Well, I don't know. You get them out of bottles, and when the bottles are empty, you send up to the chemical store for more. It's the chemical store people who make them, I suppose. Or else they send to the factory for them. I don't know. I never did any chemistry. My job was with the embryos. It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old men of the village had much more definite answers about how the world began. One day, John thought it must have been soon after his 12th birthday, he came home and found a book that he had never seen before lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and looked very old. The binding had been eaten by mice. Some of its pages were loose or torn. He picked it up and looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, drinking that horrible-smelling mescal out of a cup. "Popey brought the book," she said. "He found it in an old chest in the corner of the Temple of the Gods. It's supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true because I looked at it and it seemed to be full of nonsense. Uncivilized. Still, it'll be good enough for you to practice your reading on," she continued in a thick, drunken voice. She took a last drop, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side, and fell into a deep sleep. He began to read. The strange words rolled through his mind like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances, if the drums could have spoken, like the men singing the corn song, beautiful, beautiful so that you cried, like old Mitsima saying magic over his feathers and his sticks and his bits of bone and stone, but better than Mitsima's magic, because it talked to him. He could only half understand the words, but they were full of a beautiful and terrible magic. When he was 15, Mitsima taught him the art of making water pots. His first pot was so badly made that it leaned over to one side. "But the next one will be better," he said to himself, and began to shape another piece of clay. He learned to love the work. He found an extraordinary pleasure in making things with his hands and in learning every time to do them better. They worked all day, side by side on the riverbank, singing as they sat there making pots. "Next winter," said old Mitsima, "I will teach you to make a bow and arrows." When boys reached 16, at the time of the full moon, they would go into the temple where secrets were told to them, and they would come out men. At last it was the day when he should go in his turn. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark shapes, at the entrance to the temple. A ladder went down into a big opening below, where a red light shone. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out. He broke free and ran back to his place among the others. This time the man struck him, pulled his hair. "Not for you, White Hair." "Not for the son of the she-dog," said one of the other men. The boys laughed. "Go!" And as he still waited, standing on the edge of the group, "Go!" the men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. "Go! Go! Go!" There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit hole in the ground came the sound of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was alone. All alone outside the village on the empty plain. The rock looked like white bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley, wild dogs cried at the moon. His body hurt, the cuts were still bleeding, but it was not for pain that he cried. It was because he was all alone, because he had been driven out into this empty world of stone and moonlight. At the edge of a high rock he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist, the blood was still flowing gently. Every few seconds, a drop fell, dark, almost colourless in the dead light. Drop, drop, drop. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. He had discovered time, and death, and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a sad memory in Bernard. Alone, alone. So am I, he said in a sudden desire to share his feelings with someone else. Terribly alone. Are you? John looked surprised. I thought that in the other place, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there. Bernard reddened uncomfortably. You see, he said almost in a whisper, turning his eyes aside in shame. I'm rather different from most people, I suppose. If something happens to one's treatment and one comes out of the bottle different... Yes, that's just it, the young man nodded. If one's different, one's certain to be lonely. They're very cruel to one. Do you know, they shut me out of absolutely everything. When the other boys were sent out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream which your holy animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't tell me any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though, he added. Didn't eat anything for 5 days and then went out alone into those mountains there. He pointed. Bernard smiled a little smile of pity at the ignorance and simplicity of the young man. And did you dream of anything? He asked. The other nodded. But I mustn't tell you what. They fell silent for a while. Then Bernard said, I wonder if you'd like to come back to London, taking the first step in a plan which he had decided to carry out ever since, in the little house, he had realised who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course, if I can get permission from the World Controller, that is. Linda too? Well... He paused doubtfully. That horrible creature. No, it was impossible. Unless... It suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very ugliness might be enormously useful. But of course, he cried, making up for his first uncertainty with a show of great pleasure. The young man drew a deep breath. How amazing that it's coming true! What I've dreamt of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? His eyes shone and his face was full of bright colour. You know, Shakespeare's Miranda. She says how beautiful the world is, and the people in it. The colour suddenly grew deeper. He was thinking of Lenina, of a heavenly creature in bottle-green clothes, shining with youth and skin food, beautifully rounded in shape, sweetly smiling. Oh, brave new world, he began, then suddenly stopped and turned pale. Are you married to her? He asked. Am I what? Married. You know, forever. They say forever in the Indian words. It can't be broken. Ford, no, Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason. He laughed for pure joy. "Oh, brave new world," he repeated. "Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once." "You have the strangest way of talking sometimes," said Bernard, staring at the young man in surprise. "And anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world?" Chapter 9. My Father. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in the Bloomsbury Centre's 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. The centre was full of activity. Everyone was busy. Everything went on in an orderly manner. The moving rows of bottles, each with its developing embryo, followed one another slowly but surely through all the stages of treatment and out into the unbottling room, where the newly unbottled babies gave their first cry of horror and shock. The sound of well-oiled machinery rose softly from below. The lifts rushed up and down. On all the 11 floors of the nurseries, it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labelled infants were sucking down their bottles of artificial milk. Above them, in 10 floors of sleeping rooms, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon's sleep were as busy as anyone else, although they did not know it, listening to the lessons in their sleep-teaching program. Above these again were the playrooms, where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks, sand, and clay. The girls sang happily at their test tubes. Heads of departments whistled as they worked, and from the unbottling room came the sound of jokes and laughter. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was severe. "A public example," he was saying. "In this room, because it contains more high-class workers than any other in the centre, I have told him to come here at 2:30. Ah, here he comes." Bernard had entered and was approaching between the rows of tables with a manner which only just hid the fear that he felt. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was much too loud. When he tried to correct his mistake and went on to say, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," it was far too soft, a silly little whisper. "Yes, Mr. Marks," said the director coldly. "I did ask you to come to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand." "Yes," Bernard answered. "Yes," repeated the director. Then, suddenly raising his voice, "Ladies and gentlemen," he cried, "ladies and gentlemen." The girls stopped singing and raised their heads from the rows of test tubes. There was a deep silence. Everyone looked round. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director cried once more, "excuse me for interrupting your labours. A painful duty forces me to do so. The security of society is in danger. Yes, in danger, ladies and gentlemen. This man," he pointed an accusing finger at Bernard, "this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus to whom so much has been given and from whom, therefore, so much must be expected, has failed to honour the trust which had been placed in him. By his sinful views on sport and soma, by his shameful avoidance of convention in his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of R. Ford and behave out of office hours like a baby in a bottle, Here the director made the sign of the T. He has proved himself an enemy of society, a danger, ladies and gentlemen, to all law and order, a man sworn to destroy civilization itself. For this reason, I propose to dismiss him from the post he has held in this centre. I propose immediately to apply for him to be removed to a sub-centre of the lowest order, and, so that his punishment may be in the best interests of society, as far as possible from any important centre of population. In Iceland, he will have small opportunity to lead others into crime by his unforwardly example. The director paused. Then, folding his arms, he turned gravely to Bernard. "Marx," he said, "can you give any reason why the judgment passed on you should not now be carried out?" "Yes, I can," said Bernard in a very loud voice. Somewhat surprised, "Then show it," said the director. "Certainly. But it's in the passage. One moment." Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. "Come in," he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a cry of horror and shock. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset 2 test tubes and their contents. Fat, loose in figure, a strange and frightening image of middle age among those firm, youthful bodies, those smooth, healthy faces, Linda came into the room, smiling a smile which twisted her features and showed her black, broken teeth. Bernard walked beside her. "There he is," he said, pointing to the director. "Did you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked angrily. Then, turning to the director, "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere among 1,000. But perhaps you've forgotten. Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him, her head on one side, but with a smile that began to disappear as she saw the look of horror on the director's face. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, alarmed. The discoloured face took on an expression of extreme grief. "Tomakin!" She held out her arms. Someone began to laugh. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this criminal?" "Tomakin!" She ran forward, threw her arms round his neck, hid her face on his chest. A great shout of laughter went up. "This criminal attempt at a practical joke!" the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to pull himself away from her arms. She held on to him desperately. "But I'm Linda! I'm Linda!" The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby!" she screamed above the noise. There was an immediate and awful silence. Everyone stood there uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her in horror. "Yes, a baby! And I was its mother!" She broke away from him, ashamed, and covered her face with her hands, crying. "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin, because I always followed the instructions, didn't I? Didn't I? Always? I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin. But he was a comfort to me all the same." Turning towards the door. "John!" she called. "John!" He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked round, then moved quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, "My father." The word for father, unlike the really shameful word mother, was sometimes heard in slightly shocking jokes, put an end to the silence that had greeted his entrance. Laughter broke, burst after burst, as though it would never stop. My father. And it was the director. My father. Oh, Ford, oh, Ford. That was really too funny. The shouts of laughter broke out again. Tears streamed down the faces of those looking on. 6 more test tubes were upset. My father. Pale, wild-eyed, the director stared about him, ashamed, helpless. My father. The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room. Chapter 10. New Lives. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper-class London was anxious to see this funny creature who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatching and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the centre again, had fallen on his knees and called him, the joke was almost too good to be true, my father. Linda, on the other hand, was of no interest at all to them. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, that was no joke. It was disgusting. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage. She had come out of a bottle and been conditioned like anyone else, so she couldn't have any unusual ideas. Lastly, and this was by far the strongest reason for people's not wanting to see poor Linda, there was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth, with a discoloured skin, bad teeth, and that figure, Ford. You simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick. Yes, really sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda. And Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was, for her, the return to Soma, the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday, without ever having to come back to a headache or sickness, without ever being made to feel as you always felt after mescal, as though you'd done something so shameful that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect, and if waking up from it was unpleasant, it was so not in itself, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The answer was to make the holiday continuous. She demanded larger and more frequent amounts of Soma. Dr. Shaw was at first unwilling. Then he let her have what she wanted. She took as much as 20 grams a day, many times more than the usual quantity. "Which will finish her off in a month or 2, the doctor told Bernard in confidence. "One day she will just stop breathing. Finished. And a good thing, too, we can't make her young again." Surprisingly, as everyone thought, for on a Soma holiday Linda was most conveniently out of the way, John objected to this treatment. "But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much?" "In one sense, yes," Dr. Shaw admitted. "But in another, we're actually lengthening it." The young man stared at him questioningly. "Soma may make you lose a few years in time," the doctor went on. "But think of the enormous periods it can give you out of time. And as she hasn't got any serious work to do—" "All the same," John argued, "I don't believe it's right." The doctor waved his hand impatiently. "Well, of course, if you'd rather have her crying and shouting for it all the time." In the end, John was forced to give in. Linda got her soma. From then on, she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house, with the radio and television on, and the soma tablets within reach of her hand. It was John, then, that they all wanted to meet. And as it was only through Bernard that John could be seen, Bernard became popular for the first time in his life. Everybody tried to get invitations to his parties to meet the savage, and, as he told his friend Helmholtz, he could have as many girls as he liked just for the favour of asking them round to his apartment. "Lighter than air," said Bernard, pointing upwards. In the sky, high above them, the weather department's balloon shone pink in the sunshine. "The savage," so said Bernard's instructions, "is to be shown civilized life in all its aspects." He was being shown a bird's-eye view of it at present, a bird's-eye view from the platform of the Charing T Tower. The station master and the station's chief weather expert were acting as guides, but it was Bernard who did most of the talking. Filled with his new importance, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller, lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers stepped out of the machine. 8 dark-skinned twins in light brown looked out of the 8 windows, the stewards. 1,250 kilometres an hour, said the station master proudly. "What do you think of that, Mr. Savage?" John thought it very nice. "Still," he said, "Ariel could fly round the earth in 40 minutes. "The savage," wrote Bernard in his report to Mustapha Mond, "shows little surprise for or admiration of civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda, his Mustapha Mond made a face. Does the silly man think I should be shocked by the word written out in full? His interest is centred on what he calls the soul, which he regards as something entirely independent of the body, although, as I tried to point out to him..." The controller glanced quickly over the next sentences and was just about to turn the page in search of something more definite and more interesting when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. "Though I must admit," he read, "that I agree with the savage in finding civilized infantility too easy, or, as he puts it, not expensive enough. And I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your Fordship's attention to..." Mustapha Mond's anger gave place almost at once to amusement. The idea of this creature trying to teach him about the social order was really too ridiculous. The man must have gone mad. "I ought to give him a lesson," he said to himself, and laughed out loud. The lesson would be given later. "The savage," wrote Bernard, "refuses to take soma, and seems very upset because the woman Linda, his remains permanently on holiday. It is worth noting that in spite of the weak mental state of his and the extreme ugliness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to change and even run against natural responses. In this case, the natural response to draw back from an unpleasant object." Lenina came singing into the changing room. "You seem very pleased with yourself," said Fanny. "I am pleased," she answered. "Bernard telephoned half an hour ago. He has an unexpected engagement, and he asked me to take the Savage to the cinema this evening. I must hurry." She ran off towards the bathroom. "She's a lucky girl," said Fanny to herself as she watched Lenina go. Sunk in their deep, comfortable armchairs, Lenina and the Savage listened to the music of the electric organ. Soon the lights went down and the film began, with the figures on the screen in lifelike colours, but many times larger than life-size. The story of the film was extremely simple. It was called 3 Weeks in a Helicopter. A young black man fell out of a helicopter onto his head, went mad, and lost control of his feelings. He developed a passion for a lovely golden-haired young beta-plus girl. She refused to listen to him or to have anything to do with him. He seized her and, in spite of her struggles, threw her into his helicopter and flew up with her into the sky, where he kept her for 3 weeks, trying to make her give in to his passion. Finally, after a whole series of adventures including some exciting scenes in the air, 3 good-looking young alphas succeeded in saving her. The black man was sent off to a reconditioning centre, and the film ended in a proper and conventional manner, with the beta girl going to bed with all her 3 heroes one after the other. The picture died away, the lights came on, and the music filled the cinema again. It was the end of the performance. But for Lenina, it was not quite the end. As they moved slowly along with the crowd towards the lifts, she still felt emotions that the film had woken in her. Her cheeks were red, her eyes were bright, and she breathed deeply. She caught hold of the Savage's arm and pressed it against her side. He looked down at her for a moment, pale, pained, desiring and ashamed of his desire. He was not good enough, not... Their eyes, for a moment, met. What wonders hers promised. Passion shone in them. He looked away quickly, freed his arm from her hold. He was frightened by a feeling that he could not fully understand. He felt somehow that she might cease to be someone that he could look up to as being too good for him, and he did not want this to happen. "I don't think you ought to see things like that," he said. "Like what, John?" "Like that horrible film." "Horrible?" Lenina was surprised. "But I thought it was lovely." "It was shameful," he said angrily. "It was disgusting." She shook her head. "I don't know what you mean." Why was he always so strange? Why did he always go and spoil things? In the taxicopter, he hardly looked at her. Bound by strong promises that had never been spoken, obedient to laws that had long since ceased to have any force, he sat in silence, with his head turned away from her. The taxicopter landed on the roof of Lenina's apartment house. At last, she thought joyfully as she stepped out. At last, even though he had been so strange just now. Standing under a lamp, she looked into her hand mirror. At last. Yes, her nose did need powdering. She shook the loose powder from her powder case. While he was paying the taximan, there would just be time. She rubbed at the shine on her nose, thinking, he's very good looking. No need for him to be shy like Bernard. And yet, any other man would have done it long ago. Well, now at last. The bit of her face that she could see in the little round mirror suddenly smiled at her. "Good night," said a voice behind her in a whisper full of fear. Lenina turned round sharply. He was standing inside the door of the taxicopter, his eyes fixed, staring. He had evidently been staring all this time while she was powdering her nose, waiting. But what for? Trying to make up his mind, and all the time thinking. She could not imagine what extraordinary thoughts. Good night, Lenina, he repeated, and made a strange, desperate effort to smile. But, John, I thought you were… aren't you… He shut the door and bent down to say something to the driver. The machine rose quickly into the air. Looking down through the window in the floor, the savage could see Lenina's upturned face, pale in the light of the lamps. Her mouth was open. She was calling. Her figure rushed away from him. The square of the roof grew smaller and smaller as it fell away below him into the darkness. 5 minutes later, he was back in his room. From its hiding place, he took out his old, worn book and, carefully turning its torn and discoloured pages, he began to read Othello. Othello, he remembered, was like the main character of 3 Weeks in a Helicopter, a black man. Drying her eyes, Lenina walked across the roof to the lift. On her way down to the 27th floor, she pulled out her Soma bottle. 1 gram, she decided, would not be enough. Her unpleasant experience had been more than 1 gram suffering. But if she took 2 grams, she ran the risk of not waking up in time tomorrow morning. She decided to avoid both extremes, and into the hollow of her left hand she shook 3 half-gram tablets of Soma. Chapter 11. Emotional Problems. Bernard had to shout through the locked door. The savage would not open. But everybody's there, waiting for you. Let them wait, came back the voice faintly through the door. But you know quite well, John, that I asked them on purpose to meet you. You ought to have asked me first whether I wanted to meet them. But you always came before, John. Yes, and that's exactly why I don't want to come again. Bernard tried persuasion, not an easy thing to do when you have to shout through a locked door. Just to please me. Won't you come to please me? No. Do you seriously mean it? Yes. But what shall I do? Cried Bernard helplessly. Go to hell! Shouted the angry voice from inside. All Bernard's attempts to get John to come out failed. In the end, he had to go back to his rooms and tell all the guests who were waiting there impatiently that the savage would not be appearing that evening. They were very angry. They felt that they had been tricked into behaving politely to this unimportant little fellow Bernard Marks, with the doubtful reputation and the antisocial opinions. Lenina alone said nothing. Pale, her blue eyes filled with an unusual sadness, she sat in a corner, separated from those around her by an emotion which they did not share. She had come to the party filled with a strange feeling, a mixture of anxiety and joy. In a few minutes, she had said to herself as she entered the room, I shall be seeing him, talking to him, telling him, for she had come with her mind made up, that I like him, more than anybody I've ever known, and then perhaps he'll say… What would he say? The blood rushed to her cheeks. Why was he so strange the other night, after the cinema? So odd. And yet I'm absolutely sure he does rather like me. I'm sure. It was at this moment that Bernard had made his statement. The savage wasn't coming to the party. Lenina was filled with a terrible feeling of disappointment and emptiness. Her heart seemed to stop beating. Perhaps it's because he doesn't like me, she said to herself. And at once this possibility grew in her mind into a certainty. John had refused to come because he didn't like her. He didn't like her. All around her, the other guests were angrily discussing the savage's refusal to meet them and blaming Bernard for all that had gone wrong. Very soon they took their leave, one after the other. Lenina, the last to go, walked sadly out of the room. Bernard was left there all alone. Overcome with unhappiness and disappointment, he dropped into a chair and, covering his face with his hands, he began to cry. Upstairs in his room, the savage was reading Romeo and Juliet. Next morning, Bernard could not hide from the savage how unhappy he felt. The savage showed himself sympathetic, an attitude that Bernard had not expected. "You're more like what you were at Malpais," he said when Bernard had told him all his sorrows. "Do you remember when we first talked together, outside the little house? You're like what you were then." "Because I am unhappy again, that's why." "Well, I'd rather be unhappy than have the false, lying happiness that you are having here." "I'm surprised at you saying that," said Bernard bitterly.